listening to a download from the outdoorstation.co.uk.
Number 355.
Hello and welcome back to the Outdoor Station, and this the second part of the two-part interview with Ron Moak of Six Moon Designs, discussing the current state of play in the lightweight market and how Six Moon Designs are facing up to the fine balancing act of supply and demand in this niche sector. If you've listened to part 1, you'll be aware of why this short series has been started, as we discuss the future of lightweight with some of the still standing key players in the arena. Here we pick up where Ron describes the current state of the market in the US from his point of view. As a thought, as a generalisation, what would your description be of the key people that have sort of got involved in the ultralight revolution for the last sort of 6-7 years? Gossamer Gear, Henry Shires, Glenn Van Pesky. How are companies at the moment? What's their general state of mind regarding where they're placed and the demand for the products?
I think it's a lot depends upon you look at the different companies, and you look at where you look at their gear, and it gives you an idea of what their mindset is. You've got people like Mount Laurel Designs. He does all his work in house, and they also do everything to order essentially. They don't do, but then they have an 8-week lead time, if you want to buy something. Same thing with Z-Packs and places like that, And then you have people like us and Tarp Tent and Gossamer Gear, and we do all our production out of house. The last thing we want to do is start producing in-house, but we also tend to be older. And we're also looking for a little bit more wider market, I think. And the other thing is you've got coming in every day, you go to one of the websites like yours or somebody else, and then, some guy from, down the street is popped up. They're making the latest, ultralight pack, so it's like, you've got a whole new pack company coming in, almost on a daily basis because they're fairly easy to design, a lightweight pack, but they all look the same, but they're easy to design. So everybody comes up, creates a pack, so there's a lot of new people coming to the market on a almost a weekly basis. You don't know how many of them are going to stick around.
I mean, what's the demand like for the products? I mean, your range of products and some of the products of the companies you've mentioned has demand increased exponentially since the last 10 years? Do you think for those types of products?
We've grown. There was a couple of years in there where it was fairly flat, but we've grown. We grew significantly this last year. A lot of it because of our retail side. We're doing more retail internationally. In Asia, we've got a strong distributor in Asia, and our European distributors are selling pretty remarkably. We're still trying to catch up from last summer. Our sales just in the production sides, production both in the U.S. and in Europe, or in Asia, trying to get the production up to so we will be able to meet next year's demand. And I think that, we're looking to broaden our product line significantly, or at least move our product line into a new direction to respond to where I think, the biggest market is. I don't really see the super light, super ultralight, or that, as the biggest, contribution we can make to the overall market. I think that's pretty well handled by a lot of people out there. I mean, how many 10-ounce packs, can you make? How big is a market for a 10-ounce backpack or a product like that? What we need to be concentrating on, again, is, what I mentioned before, is trying to make ultralight irrelevant and bring in all those people who are carrying, heavier packs and allow them to move into the ultralight world and simply just replace their gear. If I can replace your existing gear with a much lighter weight gear, you don't have to change any of the way you operate, then it makes it a lot easier for you to make that transition from a more traditional to a more ultralight. And I think that's where we need to go, is to make ultralight smarter. The gear be more smarter to address people's needs.
Yeah, it was interesting at the European Trade Fair. There were a few US brands there that would fit the lightweight market as opposed to super ultralight, sort of the lighter the products you're describing, really. And they'd brought with the practicalities of the weight of the products some really nice design style, and I think that was just starting to turn a corner. So it was taking the lighter products that always looked a little bit utilitarian, because obviously they didn't have lots of things on them to keep the weight down, but actually put a bit more of a design style into them, and that started to raise the eyebrows of a lot of people passing, which is obviously a good thing.
Well, as you mentioned before, the people on the TGO, they go out for 2 weeks. That's their 2-week hike for the year. Maybe they'll do some other weekend hikes or whatnot around. But their hiking is recreational, and yet we design our gear to be professional. It's like a disconnect there. We want you to buy our gear, and then we want you to learn, basically a PhD in ultralight, so you know how to make all the stuff piece, fit together, which is fine for someone like yourself or myself who spends their entire life in this thing. It becomes second nature, but not to the average person. The average person wants to go out there and have a good time. They don't want to have to spend 3 years learning how all this stuff goes together. They want a light pack that they can assemble relatively quickly, set relatively inexpensively, and does what they need to do without having to jump through 100 hoops. Yeah, they want to, and I think that's, if you want to attract that group of people, and then you got to address the needs of those people, and not try to make them, smarter. Just make them gear that functions, and especially what we're, from our point of view, and we're still trying to attract a lot of the older crowd who's more traditional, less more resistant to change, but they're also people who generally have more money, so if they give them something lighter, they're willing to pay a little bit extra dollars for it, but we also want them to be able to go out there and recapture some of the pride and joy of their youth when they could trump, over the Monroes, with relatively ease, and still be able to do it when they're in their, 50s and 60s and 70s with lighter gear.
Available. This is the Outdoor Station.
I agree with absolutely everything you said. The number of customers we've had come to us that I'm coming back to my hobby, I've only got X number of years left, and I've got dodgy knees, hips, or whatever it might be, and they just want to enjoy it for as much as possible while they can without going to the full extent. I mean, I would say, and I think you'd probably agree with me, I would say that the elite in any activity or in any sport, be it ultralight backpacking, skiing or cycling or whatever it might be, that marketplace isn't one that's a mass marketplace at all. Those people are very, very specialised and tend to have bespoke equipment and clothing and things made for them when they get to that level. But certainly... If you look at the pyramid and the beginners, the amateurs are at the bottom and the professionals are at the top of the pyramid, that middle swathe is certainly one where I think people appreciate it and enjoy the feeling of using sort of new equipment, but within safe limitations. They're not trying to take something that's super ultralight to the top of Everest because it's just not the right thing for the job. I mean, one thing I was going to ask you about actually was, I wonder what your thoughts on this would be. I was considering the other day that actually the internet and obviously the way we've all grown and are using it now in the last 5-10 years, as a consumer, when I used to go into an outdoor shop, I would get very, very excited and holding all the various items which I considered that were going to be absolutely vital for my trip. And I really wouldn't consider the weight. I was much younger naturally, but it's even so, when they were all together, I suddenly realised what a weight it was that I'd committed myself to. But there was that impulse about purchasing when you're actually physically holding something and caressing it and stroking it and it's titanium or whatever. Whereas I find now that people, and myself included, tend to spend a lot more time researching products on the internet and listening to other people's stories and absorbing the information before, without having the long tail, but certainly before actually making the decision on the purchase. And I just wonder how much that's changed the actual consumers' shopping habits, in the sense that I think they do a lot more research now than the impulse that they would have done, say, 10, 15 years ago. Would you agree with that?
Well, if you stay with the sport, I agree with it, but you stayed with the sport of backpacking, I would call it sport, or the activity of backpacking. The more you stay with it, the more you become absorbed with it, the more you start researching it. But then, most people start out where you were. They're just out there to acquire some gear and go out and have a good time, And initially, one of the problems that we have is we have an overabundance of varieties of stuff out there, which is probably going to have to be shaken out at some point in time, because there's just, there's just so many options that you almost get to the point where if you have too many options, you have none. Because you can't weed through them all, intelligently. And so that's where, I think retailers can provide the best, service, is to help, people weed through the myriad of different, things they have, especially for a beginner, But the question, the thing for retailers is retailers have, and my biggest thing are retailers. They like to ring up sales, but they don't like to make sales. If you don't understand the difference.
Oh yeah.
If a guy walks into your store and says, "I want this," that's the best customer you're ever going to get, because he knows what he wants, and all he wants to do is give you your money. You can stamp his card, and he's walked out the door happy, and you're sitting there happy because you didn't have to spend, 3 hours trying to convince somebody that this widget was better than that widget. But the problem is that, trying to get, an educated sales force out there who can understand, ultralight is difficult and has been, almost proven to be impossible. So the onus is on those of us who create ultralight gear to basically, make that, help that salesperson make the leap. And the only way we can do that is to make the gear lighter, but still does it with the same functionality.
Yeah, but I think we're coming back to the social media in whatever format you choose to use it, whether it's blogs or YouTube or whatever, has done a lot of work for you. And
it has.
People,
that is basically, 90%. We don't, none of us are big, so we don't have a lot of marketing, and 90% of our sales are word of mouth. If I sell you something and you like it, then you tell your friend, and he goes out and buys one, and he tells his friend, he goes out and buys one, things like that. That's basically where, our sales come from, is identifying a need and getting somebody to buy it. And we're very limited in shops. We have, maybe a dozen dealers. And so that's not a major component right now of our sales. But I think that, from at some point in time, though, you do have to move into the more, if you want to move into the more mainstream, you've got to move into the more retail side, simply so people can get access to your gear on a physical basis, especially if they're not, if they just, the kind of person like you mentioned, they just walk in the shop and see something that says that's exciting and they walk out with it. We've actually been able to do that with, we have a tent that we sell for $125, the Skyscape Scout. It's a 2-pound, 2-ounce tent, which is 5 years ago would have still been considered ultralight. Today's market is considered, slightly heavier than that. But it's $125, and stores can set it up, and people walk in the door, and they'll see it, they'll pick it up, they'll hold it in their hands, and they'll see it laid out there on the thing. They can crawl into it, and then they say, how much is it? $125. And the guy says, okay, that's a no-brainer. He walks out the door with it, and he didn't even think about buying a tent, And that's where you're getting to a point where you've got a price level, and a weight level to the point where it becomes less of an issue in terms of, of a purchase. And that's where retailers can give you, and it's kind of hard to do that on the internet because, it's just another product and another name out there.
So you're saying then really that the future for lightweight and ultralight in particular is actually more and more education?
Education in a way. I'm a little leery about education to a certain extent because, as much as I love it, as much as I spend a lot of time talking to people about it, I think that it can be a barrier. If you demand people, be smart to use your gear. Then you are, we should be smart ourselves. If we're going to be designers, we should be smart and we should adapt our gear to the way people, normally act.
I wasn't meaning sort of making them smart. I was more meaning the education from a point of view of awareness and enlightenment of people's ideas and understandings. So back to that thing I said at the very beginning about questioning everything they've already got in their collection and going, well, why have I been carrying this really?
I think that's
type of education. Yeah,
that is that's a critical aspect. The biggest education that and the most difficult education, because they're counterproductive. Somebody asked me the other a number of years ago, why did backpacking gear get so heavy? And my comment was it didn't get heavy until we had backpacking shops. The bane of backpacking gear was backpacking shops. When I bought my gear on the AT, I bought standard gear, but I didn't buy much of it. I bought a 5-pound pack, but I only had one 5-pound pack, and I had heavy gear, but I didn't have all the other crap that goes along with it. So my base pack weight was fairly light because I didn't have all the other stuff that you when you walk into a backpacking shop that lines the shelves, because there wasn't any shops to go in there and people say you need to have this ultralight espresso maker and a 2-pound first aid kit and all the other stuff that goes with it, and I was able to develop a kit in the 70s to do the AT, and my base weight was around 19 pounds. At 35 pounds, and that was with 10 days of food. And it wasn't until a few years later when, back in the late 80s and then the 90s, when it was people were doing that, walking the backpacker shop and walking out there with, 45 pounds, 50 pounds of gear. It's because they had so many options, and they started buying it. And so, and you walk into a gear store, the first thing that should be there should be a scale.
Yeah.
How many gear stores have scales that you can sit there and put a piece of gear on and says, how much does it weigh?
You're listening to the award-winning UK Business Podcaster of the Year.
The home of UK-based audio and video podcasts for lovers of the great outdoors everywhere.
Podcasts are based solely around self-powered travel.
This is the Outdoor Station.
when you look back to the the person that is mentioned by everybody really, Grandma Gatewood in 1955, and what she carried on the AT. 1955, she didn't have any options. She probably was a practical, realistic person. She was 67 at the time, and it's a case of, well, I'm going to travel from A to B. I'm resourceful. I'll make what I need. I don't want to carry any more than this. That was it. There was no alternative for her. There couldn't have been at that stage. As you say, the whole outdoor industry wasn't developed at all.
Right. If you look back then, the only stores out there were selling any outdoor gear were the Army, Navy stores were selling cast-off World War II stuff in Vietnam or in Korea gear.
And hunters, of course. Right,
and hunters, but hunters don't backpack. Relatively speaking, they'll backpack far enough in to to haul a carcass out, but they don't really go out. At least not in the U.S. for days on end.
Yeah.
So there was a day, and she wasn't plugged into that. So she basically walked around her house and said, this will do for this will do for that. Who else would think of a shower curtain as a shelter?
Yeah, well, I presume she's on a budget as well. At the end of the day, they didn't have much money in the 1950s, did they? So it was a case of needs must and make things work. So
practicality.
Yeah. And really, that's, I think, where our lightweight interest in the customers and the people we speak to tends to be. We have a very there's quite a close relationship in the UK between sort of hikers and backpackers generally, and walkers and country folk, and we call them bushcrafters, people who are more interested in living in the woods, should we say, not from a survivalist point of view, but just because from a simplistic point of view. Some of which are, they do tend to export the house with them, and others will take it very, very simply, and they're also a big part of our customer base. But the relationship between all these sort of outdoor people and the fishermen and, as I say, the hikers, walkers, and general people interested in the country, because the countryside, because the UK is fairly small, and you're never going to be more than 6 miles from a metalled road, as I heard today. You can still have a fair amount of wilderness when you're on your own, but you're not going to have the same sort of exploratory type approach as would have been fairly obvious and fairly regular in the 1950s.
Yeah.
Right, well, let's just change tack slightly and have a bit of fun.
Okay.
Right, on your last trip, wherever that might be, if you'd like to tell us a bit about that, I'd like to ask you, what was in your rucksack that you actually paid for?
Well, the last real trip I took, other than October, we do what we call the UL Brain Trust hike. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
No.
Basically, it started about 6 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, where basically it was four of us. It was Glenn Van Pesky, Henry Shires, Brian Franklin, and I. We'd try to go out once a year and do a backpacking trip together, and we were, one year we did around Tahoe. Another time we went into the Sierras and different places. Went up in St. Helens area and whatnot. So we, it's basically a way to get together and, talk, shop, I guess, So we do that. We had a trip this last year up in the Goat Rocks up in September, and that was actually with Henry Shires and Glenn Van Pesky couldn't make it, so Grant Seibel filled in for him and myself. But before that was basically the TGO. I did that. I haven't been so busy lately. I haven't had a chance to go out and do long hikes. This year, I do plan on spending about 5 weeks out on the trail, and that's to finish the CDT, so I can finish my Triple Crown. But in general, when I'm looking at gear, essentially the only gear that I'm buying is my clothes for the most part, and my sleeping bag or quilt. probably about the only major gear that I carry that I haven't produced myself.
Is the quilt market taking off, or has it been quite a substantial market over the last few years? Because I'm certainly getting more interested in that myself.
Well, it's a good question. I'm not in that market, so I don't know what the sales are overall. I've basically only ever really used a quilt for the last almost 40 years. Even when I used a sleeping bag, I always used as a quilt. I never liked to sleep in a sleeping bag mummified. I move around too much. So I've always, found the quilt to be the preferable way to sleep. But in terms of how it compares to the sleeping bags, in terms of sales, I have no idea really. I know a lot of people use them, because they do make a lot of sense, and they can be quite a bit lighter. Mine is like 18 ounces, and I used it on the TGO, and it was a 30-degree bag, and I was perfectly comfortable.
What make is that then? What's the brand or product?
I believe it's Nunatech. I'm always get their name pronunciation wrong. It's some Indian word, but it's one that comes out of Eastern Washington. It was an offshoot of Feathered Friends. So that's a really nice, 18-ounce bag with a Pertex shell.
And what pad do you use with that? Do you use an inflatable pad with a lot of insulation?
Well, actually, this time I took a ridge rest, but for the last, about 5 years, I sleep on Reflectix. You know what that is?
No, I've not heard of that one.
Reflectix is essentially it's a product. It's bubble wrap with aluminum foil on both sides.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
It's used a lot for wrapping around things like water heater, and pipes and whatnot to keep them from freezing. It's about a quarter-inch thick. And I've used that basically as my pad for years. But I discovered long ago that if I sleep on a hard surface year round, then when I sleep out in the woods, I don't really need much of a pad, and people hike with me just, sometimes are amazed because I'll just lay down there in the dirt and go fall asleep immediately and, with no pad or anything. And
that only happens to me when I come out the pub sometimes. That tends to be...
a little different. You have a little help on that side. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So what about the sort of cooking equipment then? What's your preference on cooking gear?
I've used basically on the cooking equipment is used the Trail Designs kit, the cone,
Caldera cone.
Yeah, the Caldera cone.
Right.
That's a really good kit. I made alcohol stoves going back for over a decade. And then when they started making theirs, it was just a lot easier to use theirs. It's nice and light, and it's flex, and it does everything I need to do. So I discovered I didn't really need to make my own. I have a whole shelf downstairs with a host of different makes and models of alcohol stoves. But and I use alcohol most of the time. I hate Esbit, but I have used it in the past.
Have you not been tempted to go down the organic, the wood burning route?
Well, it's I really haven't. I haven't had that. I'm afraid that if I start building a wood burning fire for cooking, I might want to expand it just to sit around and watch it burn. And I also hike, a lot in places where in the U.S., if you're in the high countries and in the Cascades or the Sierras or whatnot, often in the summertime, wood burning is discouraged, even on the CDT, because it's too dry. And so they would like to put the kibosh on alcohol stoves, but you can pretty much get away with it. But a wood burning stove is not recommended when you're in a situation where you could put the forest on fire.
Changing the tack slightly, just so we can sort of wind up now. What are your thoughts towards the next few years? How do you think there's going to be any trends changing? Anything particularly developing that you can see? You have an inkling might start developing interests or gear or I don't know, materials, anything like that that's sort of starting to tickle your fancy at all?
Well, I materials will come and go. I don't rely on them too much in terms of expectations on materials, because Cuban fiber is the biggest, obviously the biggest thing right now. We do produce some Cuban fiber products, but I think it's more of a whiz bang than it is any true. It's a non-needed item, and my friends at Cubic Tech will probably be aghast to hear me say that. And even though we've produced a successful shelter with it and we'll continue to produce shelter with it, I'm not sure that it really changes the nature of the game, because the weight savings is nice, but it's fairly marginal and the price is just astronomical.
It's not cheap material, is it?
It's definitely not cheap material, and I don't think there's a ghost in chance it'll ever become cheap, because of production. Even if you ramp or triple the production or quadruple the production or 10x or 20x the production, I don't think you can scale it to the point where you can make it as cheap as you can, standard fabrics. I may be wrong, but, that's my take on it right now. I think most of the innovation is just going to be was going to come from how we think about how people use the gear and how we design the gear, so that it becomes more in line with how people use it. I mean, that's kind of it's hard to say, and I think if we were having this discussion a month from now, I could probably be a little bit more, clear on it.
Well, you've got everybody's interest peaked, I'm sure, with this news of something forthcoming that's very exciting. So that's good. We'll have to pay attention to the website, of course, and the announcement whenever the announcement comes on what the products relate to. Okay. Well, all I'd finish to say is to thank you very much indeed for your time. Thank you. It's been very interesting to catch up with you and have a chat. And obviously, everybody should be looking at the sixmoonsdesign.com website anyway, which I'm sure they will have done all the way through this, and be listening to your thoughts as well as looking at some of the products. And wish you all the best for Christmas 2012 and into 2013.
You too, and have a merry one. Have a pint on me.
Now that's talking.
All right, well, take care now.
Cheers to you too, Ron, and indeed a good pint of real ale was had following that interview. My thanks to Ron Moak at Six Moon Designs for taking the time and sharing his thoughts on this wide and varied topic. Of course, all links can be found over on the Outdoor Station, along with the ability to leave a comment and any contribution you may wish to make on the subject. As I mentioned before, our next interview will be with Henry Shires of tarptents.com, so keep an eye out for that. Until next time, folks, thanks for listening, thanks for joining us, and take care out there. Bye for now.
If you have any feedback, questions or suggestions, why not drop us a line either on Facebook or directly to our email address, info@theoutdoorstation.co.uk.
The home of UK-based audio and video podcasts for outdoors people everywhere.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To hear more from our extensive free library, please visit the website at theoutdoorstation.co.uk. The home of UK-based audio and video podcasts for outdoors people everywhere.